I'm Jean, 29 female. I live in a city that never seems to sleep, in an apartment that I paid for with my own sweat and sleepless nights. As a forensic accountant, my life is a world of numbers, patterns, and the stories they tell, stories of deceit, fraud, and hidden truths. It's a job that requires a meticulous mind and a healthy dose of skepticism, traits I thought I left at the office. My life was a quiet equilibrium of work, solitude, and the occasional family gathering, which I attended more out of duty than desire. Little did I know, the biggest case of fraud I would ever uncover wouldn't be in a client's files, but within the walls of my own family home. This is the story of how a wedding gift turned into the catalyst for a war, and how I used the very skills they underestimated to dismantle their world, one number at a time. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The wedding was, by all accounts, a spectacle. My younger sister Isabel had always been the star of the family, and her wedding to Ben, a slick financial advisor with a Colgate smile, was her grandest performance yet. The venue was a sprawling historical estate, dripping with wisteria and fairy lights. Hundreds of guests, a collection of my father's business associates and Isabel's influencer friends, mingled on the manicured lawns, champagne flutes in hand. My father, Martin, a real estate developer whose ambition was only matched by his ego, beamed as if he himself had orchestrated the sunset. My mother, Eleanor, drifted through the crowd, her smile as practiced and delicate as the lace on her dress. I, on the other hand, felt like a ghost at the feast. I had contributed, more than contributed, I had funded, a significant portion of this extravagance. A year ago, my father had approached me with a family investment opportunity. He was starting a new development project, a series of luxury condos, and promised a substantial return. He knew I had been saving diligently, my life's goal being to open my own independent accounting firm. He sold it as a way to keep the money in the family, a chance for us all to prosper together. I had hesitated. My professional instincts screamed at me to demand contracts, to scrutinize every document. But this was my father. This was family. So I transferred the bulk of my life savings, a sum that took me nearly a decade to accumulate, into a joint account he managed. He promised it would be more than doubled by the time the project was complete, which he assured me would be just after Isabel's wedding. "Think of it, Jean," he'd said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "You help the family now, and we help you launch your dream. It's perfect." The wedding itself was a blur of pastel colors and polite conversation. I watched Isabel, radiant in a dress that probably cost more than my car, laugh with a fakeness that only a sister could detect. She and I were night and day. She thrived on attention, crafting a perfect life for her online followers, while I found comfort in the quiet certainty of a balanced ledger. We were never close. She saw my quiet nature as a weakness, my meticulousness as a bore. To her, I was the sensible, reliable older sister, useful, but ultimately uninteresting. During the reception, my father clinked a glass for a toast. He stood on the stage, his arm around Isabel, the picture of a proud patriarch. "To my beautiful daughter, Isabel, and my new son, Ben," he boomed, "may your life together be as prosperous and beautiful as this day, a day made possible by the love and support of a strong family." He glanced at me, a brief, almost imperceptible nod. I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name, pride perhaps mixed with a growing unease. The sheer scale of the event was staggering. The floral arrangements alone must have cost a small fortune. The 5-course meal, the open bar with top-shelf liquor, the 10-piece band flown in from out of state, it all added up to an astronomical sum. My mind, ever the accountant, couldn't help but run the numbers. The cost was far beyond what my father's recent business ventures should have allowed. I pushed the thought away. This was a day for celebration, not suspicion. Later that evening, as the party raged on, I found a quiet corner on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The cool night air was a welcome respite from the stuffy ballroom. My mother found me there, her expression a mixture of fatigue and contentment. "It's a beautiful evening, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft. It is, I agreed. Isabel looks happy. She does, your father has given her the world. She paused, adjusting her shawl. Jean, your father and I, we are so grateful for your contribution. We know it was a lot to ask. It was an investment, I corrected her gently. For the family, and for my firm. Of course, she said, though her eyes didn't quite meet mine. It's just, you've always been the responsible one. So practical. Sometimes I worry you don't let yourself have enough fun. Her words, meant to be kind, felt like a subtle dig. It was the same old story. I was the serious one, the boring one, while Isabel was the vibrant, fun-loving one. It was a role I had been cast in since childhood, and one I had grown to resent. I changed the subject, asking about her plans for the coming months. We spoke for a few minutes, the conversation polite and superficial, before she was called away by a friend. I stayed on the terrace, watching the dancers inside. I saw my father laughing with a group of men, his gestures expansive and confident. I saw Isabel and Ben cutting their towering wedding cake, their smiles blindingly bright for the cameras. They looked like a perfect couple, the stars of a perfect life. But as an accountant, I knew that perfection was often an illusion, a carefully constructed facade designed to hide the messy reality underneath. The feeling of unease returned, stronger this time. It was a faint dissonance, a number that didn't add up, a detail that was out of place. I thought back to the conversation with my father about the investment. He had been vague on the details, brushing off my questions with paternalistic reassurances. "Leave the numbers to me," he had said. "You just focus on your work." At the time, I had deferred to his experience. Now, I wondered if I had mistaken confidence for something else entirely. I thought about the joint account. I had access to it, of course, but I had made a conscious decision not to check it. I wanted to trust them. I wanted to believe in the idea of family, in the promise that we were all in this together. Checking the account would have felt like an accusation, a betrayal of that trust. But as the band played its final song and the guests began to depart, a cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a statement. A statement of wealth and success that felt unearned. And I had a sickening feeling that I was the one who had paid the price for it. As I drove home, the lavish images of the wedding replayed in my mind. The champagne tower, the designer suits, the cascade of orchids. It was a party fit for royalty, funded by a promise. A promise I was beginning to fear was as hollow as the laughter that had echoed through the grand ballroom. The foundation of my future, the dream of my own firm, was tied up in that promise. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that the foundation was built not on solid ground, but on sand. The tide was coming in, and I was afraid of what would be left when it receded. The day after the wedding was a Sunday. The house I grew up in, a large suburban home that my father had built as a testament to his success, was quiet. The post-celebration exhaustion hung in the air, thick and heavy like the scent of wilted flowers. Isabel and Ben had already left for their extravagant 2-week honeymoon in the Maldives, a trip detailed in a glossy itinerary left on the kitchen counter. My parents were in the living room, nursing cups of coffee and basking in the afterglow of what they considered their greatest social triumph. I had come over for the traditional post-wedding family brunch, though the thought of food made my stomach churn. The knot of dread from the night before had not dissipated. If anything, it had grown colder and heavier. I needed answers. I needed the reassurance that my life savings were safe, that my future was secure. "Morning," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. My father looked up from his newspaper, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, Jean, good of you to join us. What a night, eh? I think we showed them how it's done." "It was certainly memorable," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "Dad, I was hoping we could talk about the investment. Now that the wedding is over, I'd like to get an update on the condo project and discuss the timeline for withdrawing my funds to start setting up my firm." The smirk on my father's face faltered for a fraction of a second, so quickly I might have missed it if I wasn't watching him so closely. He folded the newspaper and set it down on the coffee table. Jean, Always business, even on a Sunday morning. Can't you just relax and enjoy the moment? Your sister had the wedding of her dreams. I am happy for Isabel, I said, my patience beginning to fray. But this is about my future. You said the funds would be available after the wedding. I've already started looking at office spaces. I need to know what to expect. My mother shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Honey, let's not talk about money right now. It's unseemly. It's unseemly to talk about my own money. I countered, my voice ing slightly. I put every penny I had into this, based on your word. My father let out a sigh, a theatrical display of paternal weariness. All right, fine. If you must know, there have been some minor delays with the project. Supply chain issues, you know how it is. These things happen. The market is a bit volatile right now. It's not the best time to pull the money out. What kind of delays? I pressed, my internal alarms blaring. And what does market volatility have to do with it? This was a development project, not a stock portfolio. The returns were supposed to be based on construction and sales, not market fluctuations. You wouldn't understand the complexities of it, Jean, he said dismissively. It's high-level real estate, not like the simple bean counting you do. The condescension in his tone was a familiar sting. He had always belittled my profession, my careful, meticulous world, a stark contrast to his own, which was built on risks, handshakes, and gut feelings. Try me, I said, my voice cold. I'm a forensic accountant. I understand complexities. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Look, the bottom line is the money is tied up. It will be available, just not right now. Maybe in 6 months, maybe a year. A year, the word hung in the air, a death sentence for my immediate plans. A year? That was not our agreement. Our agreement was after the wedding. I have a business plan, I have a timeline. I can't just put my life on hold for a year. Well, you might have to, he said, his voice hardening. You're part of this family, and sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the good of the family. This wedding, it was important, for Isabel, for our reputation. The pieces started to click into place, forming a horrifying picture. The extravagant venue, the designer dress, the endless champagne. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a performance staged with my money. The wedding, I said, my voice barely a whisper. You used my investment to pay for the wedding. My mother gasped, placing a hand over her heart. Jean, how can you say such a thing? But my father didn't deny it. He just looked at me, his eyes cold and devoid of any remorse. Don't be so dramatic. It wasn't like that. We borrowed from the fund. It was a temporary liquidity issue. The money will be replenished when the first condos sell. You borrowed from my life savings to throw a party? I felt a wave of nausea. The trust I had so foolishly placed in them, was crumbling, turning to dust. You had no right. That was not your money to borrow. It's a family fund, he thundered, rising to his feet. For the family, you are so selfish, Jean. All you can think about is yourself and your little business. Your sister deserved a perfect day. We did what we had to do to provide that for her. She deserved it. I looked from my father's furious face to my mother's tear-streaked one. She deserved a lavish party paid for with my future. What about what I deserve? I worked for 10 years for that money. I gave up vacations, I lived in a tiny apartment, I put everything into that fund. For a dream you just lit on fire to keep your precious reputation warm. You'll be fine, my father said, waving a dismissive hand. You're smart, you'll make more money, you'll survive. The casual cruelty of his words stole the air from my lungs. He wasn't just admitting to taking the money, he was justifying it, framing it as my duty, my sacrifice. My contribution to the family was not to be a successful, independent woman, but to be a resource, a vault to be emptied for their desires. I looked at my mother, pleading with my eyes for her to say something to defend me. She just wrung her hands, avoiding my gaze. Your father knows best, Jean, she murmured. He always has. In that moment, the last vestiges of my childhood illusions about my family died. They were not my protectors, they were my predators. I was not a daughter, I was an asset that had just been liquidated. I stood up, my body trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. "I want to see the account statements," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Now." My father scoffed. "There's nothing to see. I told you the money is tied up in the project." "Then it should be easy to show me the transactions," I retorted. "Unless, of course, there is no project." The flash of panic in his eyes was all the confirmation I needed. The condo development, the family investment, the promised returns, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed story to get his hands on my money. And I, the meticulous accountant who could spot a fraudulent entry from a mile away, had fallen for it, blinded by the one thing I couldn't quantify: hope. The hope that my family, for once, saw me as more than just a safety net. "Get out of my house," my father snarled, his face turning a blotchy red. "You come in here, the day after your sister's beautiful wedding, and you make these ill accusations. You are an ungrateful, selfish child." "I may be ungrateful," I said, walking towards the door, my mind already racing, shifting from grief to cold, hard calculation. "But you're about to find out just how selfish I can be." I left the house without another word, the sound of my mother's quiet sobs following me out the door. The sun was bright, the suburban street was peaceful, but for me, the world had gone dark. The vault was empty. The promises were broken. But the fight was just beginning. They thought I would just survive. They had no idea I was about to go to war. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The quiet, orderly world I had built for myself had been shattered, and in its place was a maelstrom of anger and betrayal. The conversation with my parents replayed in my mind, each word a fresh wound. My father's dismissiveness, my mother's silent complicity, the casual way they had sacrificed my future for a single day of social climbing. They hadn't just taken my money. They had stolen my trust, my sense of security, the very foundation on which I had built my life. When I got back to my apartment, the first thing I did was turn on my computer. The dread I had been feeling was no longer a vague premonition. It was a cold, hard certainty. I navigated to my bank's website, my heart pounding in my chest. I had avoided looking at the joint account for a year, clinging to a naive belief in familial loyalty. Now, I was about to face the consequences of that willful ignorance. I logged in, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed in the password. The main page loaded, showing a summary of my accounts. My personal checking and savings accounts were there, their balances meager compared to what they should have been. And then there was the joint investment account, the one I shared with my father. I clicked on it. The screen refreshed, and the number that appeared made me gasp. Balance, $1,257.34. A little over $1,000. That was all that was left of the nearly $250,000 I had saved over a decade. $250,000 gone. It was a punch to the gut, so visceral it left me breathless. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, unable to process the sheer scale of the theft. The number was an insult, a final, mocking gesture. They hadn't even bothered to empty it completely, leaving behind just enough to twist the knife. My training kicked in, pushing past the initial wave of shock and grief. A forensic accountant doesn't just look at the final number, they look at the story of how it got there. I clicked on the View Transactions link. The page loaded, a year's worth of financial activity laid bare. It was worse than I could have imagined. The transactions started about 10 months ago, a few months after I had deposited my savings. There were large withdrawals, tens of thousands of dollars at a time, made out to vendors I had never heard of. Exquisite Events LLC, Ethereal Blooms Inc., Prestige Catering Group. They were all clearly related to the wedding. My father hadn't just borrowed from the fund, he had systematically drained it to pay for every single detail of Isabel's fantasy. But that wasn't all. As I scrolled down, I saw other, more personal transactions. A withdrawal of $50,000 to a luxury car dealership. Another for $25,000 to a high-end jewelry store, no doubt for the family heirloom necklace my mother had gifted Isabel at the bridal shower. And then there was Isabel herself, There were dozens of direct transfers to her personal account, labeled with innocuous descriptions like living expenses or support. She had been living off my savings for months, funding her influencer lifestyle of expensive brunches, designer clothes, and sponsored trips, all while I was working 60-hour weeks, believing my money was growing in a legitimate investment. The most damning discovery, however, was related to my father's business. There was no large outflow of funds to a new development project, no payments to architects, contractors, or city planning departments. The condo project was a complete fabrication. Instead, I saw a series of transfers to an entity called Martin Properties Holding, which I knew was his main company. But they weren't investments. They were structured in a way that made them look like loan repayments or service fees. He was using my money to plug holes in his failing business, to keep up the appearance of success while his real estate empire was crumbling. He had not only stolen from me to fund his daughter's wedding and lifestyle, but he had also used my life savings as a personal slush fund to prop up his own financial irresponsibility. The betrayal was multifaceted, a complex web of lies and deceit that implicated my entire family. My father, the architect of the fraud; my sister, the greedy beneficiary; my mother, the Lent enabler who chose to look the other way. Even Ben, Isabel's new husband, the financial advisor, must have known. He would have seen the influx of cash into Isabel's accounts. He would have known that her lifestyle was not supported by her meager influencer income. He was complicit, a willing participant in the scheme. The final transaction was the cruelest. It was a withdrawal of $10,000 made just 2 days before the wedding, with the memo, "final touches." They had drained the very last of my dreams to pay for party favors and ice sculptures. I felt a strange sense of calm descend over me, the kind that comes after a devastating storm when the wind and rain finally cease, and all that is left is the wreckage. The emotional turmoil, the shock, the hurt, the grief, receded, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged clarity. They had left me with nothing. No savings, no firm, no family, but they had also underestimated me. They saw me as Jean, the quiet, responsible daughter. They had forgotten that I was also Jean, the forensic accountant. The woman who could find the truth in a mountain of numbers. The woman who could follow a digital trail to its very end. I began to work. My personal apartment transformed into a war room. I downloaded every transaction, every statement. I cross-referenced the vendor names, pulling up their business registrations, their owners, their addresses. I started building a timeline, a meticulous record of the theft. I created a spreadsheet, a balance sheet of betrayal, with debits of stolen funds and credits of lies. The numbers didn't lie. They told a story of greed, entitlement, and a staggering lack of conscience. They revealed a family that was not a source of support, but a parasitic entity that had been feeding on me for a year. My father's words echoed in my head, "You'll survive." It wasn't a comfort, it was a dismissal. He believed that I would simply absorb the loss, that I would quietly rebuild, that I would eventually forgive, because that's what good daughters do. He had counted on my love for the family to be greater than my love for myself. He was wrong. They had started a war with a balance sheet. I would end it with one. They had used my money to build a beautiful facade. I would use my skills to tear it down, brick by brick, until nothing was left but the ugly truth, exposed for all the world to see. The plan began to form in my mind, not born of rage, but of cold, calculated logic. It was a plan that would require precision, patience, and every ounce of my professional expertise. They had laughed at my bean counting. They wouldn't be laughing for much longer. The audit had begun. The week that followed my discovery was a blur of methodical, relentless work. I operated on caffeine and a cold fury that had settled deep in my bones. I took a leave of absence from my job, telling my boss I had a family emergency, which was, in a grim way, the absolute truth. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of calm and order, was now littered with financial documents, legal pads filled with notes, and the glow of my laptop screen, which rarely dimmed. I was no longer just Jean, the victim. I was Jean, the investigator, and my own family was the subject of my audit. My first step was to dig deeper into my father's business, Martin Properties Holding. He had always projected an image of immense success, the self-made man, the shrewd developer who could turn dirt into gold. But the transfers from my account suggested a different story. They weren't the actions of a thriving businessman, they were the desperate moves of someone trying to stay afloat. I started with public records. I searched for property deeds, building permits, and business licenses connected to my father's company. What I found was a pattern of trouble. Several of his recent projects were stalled. There were liens filed against his properties from unpaid contractors. There were records of lawsuits from disgruntled investors. The luxury condo project he had pitched to me, it didn't exist. There were no permits, no land purchases, no architectural plans filed with the city. It was a complete fiction, a ghost project designed to lure me in. He wasn't building an empire, he was managing a collapse. He had been using my money, and likely the money of other investors, in a classic Ponzi-like scheme, using new investments to pay off old debts and maintain the illusion of solvency. The wedding was not just an act of familial indulgence, it was a crucial piece of business theater. It was a way to project an image of wealth and stability to his partners and creditors, to reassure them that Martin Properties was still a titan of industry, all while he was secretly bleeding cash. Next, I turned my attention to Isabel and Ben. I knew their lifestyle was funded by my savings, but I needed to understand the full extent of their complicity. Isabel's social media was a goldmine of evidence. Her feed was a curated gallery of extravagance, a new luxury car, a surprise gift from her adoring father, designer handbags, five-star hotel stays, and of course, the fairy tale wedding. Each post was a digital breadcrumb, a time-stamped piece of evidence of her participation in the fraud. She wasn't just a passive beneficiary, she was an active performer in the charade. Ben, the financial advisor, was more subtle, but his involvement was just as clear. A man in his profession would have to be willfully blind not to question the sudden, massive influx of undocumented cash into his fiancée's accounts. A quick search of his professional record revealed something interesting. A disciplinary action from a financial regulatory authority 2 years prior for failure to perform due diligence. He had a history of looking the other way when it was convenient. He wasn't just complicit, he was a potential co-conspirator, using his financial knowledge to help the family manage the stolen funds without raising red flags. As I pieced together the puzzle, the scope of their collective deceit was breathtaking. It was a family enterprise, a conspiracy of greed built on a foundation of lies. And I was the cornerstone they had sacrificed to keep it all from crumbling. During this time, I had no contact with them. They didn't call, they didn't text. It was as if, by banishing me from the house, they had banished me from existence. They believed I was off somewhere, licking my wounds, quietly accepting my fate. They had no idea I was meticulously documenting their downfall. One evening, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. "Jean, your father is very upset. You need to apologize. We are a family. We need to stick together." The hypocrisy of her words was so profound it was almost laughable. I typed back a simple, cold response. "There is nothing to apologize for." I then blocked her number and my father's and Isabel's. I was severing the ties, one by one. There was no family left to save. My investigation led me to an online forum for construction subcontractors. I created an anonymous profile and started asking questions about Martin Properties. The responses came pouring in. Stories of unpaid invoices, of bounced checks, of crews walking off jobs because they hadn't been paid in months. My father wasn't just cheating his daughter. He was cheating dozens of hardworking people, small business owners who were now facing their own financial crises because of his fraud. I found one contractor, a man named George, who was particularly vocal. He had done the electrical work on one of my father's last completed projects and was owed over $100,000. He was on the verge of losing his business. I contacted him through a private message, still under my anonymous profile. I told him I was an accountant who had been wronged by Martin Properties and was gathering information. He was hesitant at first, wary of being burned again. But as I shared some of the non-personal details of my findings, the stalled projects, the public liens, he began to open up. He told me stories of my father's charm, his big promises, and his eventual, complete disappearance when it was time to pay. He painted a picture of a man who had become a predator, preying on the trust of those around him. George became my first, unwitting ally. He connected me with other contractors, plumbers, and suppliers, all of whom had been cheated by my father. I listened to their stories, collected their evidence, unpaid invoices, bounced checks, threatening letters from my father's lawyers. Each piece of paper was another nail in the coffin I was building. The cracks in my father's foundation were turning into gaping fissures. He had built his world on a mountain of debt and deceit, and it was about to come crashing down. My plan was no longer just about recovering my money or getting revenge. It was about justice. Justice for me, and for all the other people my family had wronged in their relentless pursuit of a life they hadn't earned. I had the evidence. I had the motive. Now, all I needed was the right weapon to bring the whole rotten structure down. And I knew exactly what it was. With a mountain of evidence compiled, the next phase of my plan required me to step out from behind the computer screen. It was time to assemble the human element of my wrecking ball. My goal was twofold: to create a legal and financial storm so severe that my family would have no choice but to face the consequences, and to ensure that their public humiliation was as spectacular as the wedding they had thrown at my expense. My first official stop was a lawyer's office. Not just any lawyer, but the best, most ruthless financial litigator in the city, a woman named Ms. Evelyn Reed. She had a reputation for being a shark, a brilliant legal mind who took on complex fraud cases and rarely lost. Her fees were exorbitant, but I knew she was a necessary investment. I walked into her sleek, downed office with a binder 3 inches thick, my entire investigation neatly organized, tabbed, and cross-referenced. Ms. Reed was an imposing woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. She listened intently as I laid out the entire story, from the initial investment to the empty bank account, the fake condo project, and the evidence I had gathered on my father's broader financial misconduct. I spoke calmly and professionally, presenting the facts as I would in a boardroom, letting the numbers and documents tell the story of the betrayal. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. She looked at the binder, then back at me. "This is comprehensive," she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. "You've done most of my paralegal's work for them." "I'm a forensic accountant," I said simply. "It's what I do." "So I see," she replied. "And what precisely is your desired outcome, Ms. Jean?" "I want my money back," I said, my voice hard as steel. "All of it. And I want them to be held accountable. Not just for what they did to me, but for what they've done to everyone. I want Martin Properties forced into bankruptcy. I want my father's business assets liquidated. I want my sister and her husband investigated for their role in the fraud. I don't just want to win, I want to obliterate them." A slow smile spread across Ms. Reed's face. "I believe we can certainly work towards that." With Ms. Reed on board, the legal gears began to turn. She drafted a lawsuit that was a work of art, a detailed, scathing indictment of my father, my sister, and my brother-in-law, accusing them of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and civil conspiracy. But we didn't file it just yet. That was a card we would play at the most opportune moment. My next step was to contact the state's contractor board and the Department of Business Regulation. I compiled an anonymous, comprehensive complaint against Martin Properties, detailing the evidence I had gathered from George and the other unpaid subcontractors. I attached copies of the bounced checks and fraudulent invoices. This would trigger an official investigation, one that would put my father's business practices under a microscope he could not escape. Then, I focused on Isabel and Ben. Isabel's influencer career was built on a lie, a curated image of success she hadn't earned. I began to document every sponsored post, every brand partnership she had. I then cross-referenced these with the timeline of her receiving my stolen money. It was clear that she had used my funds to inflate her lifestyle, which in turn attracted these brand deals. She was, in essence, profiting from a crime. For Ben, I took a different approach. As a licensed financial advisor, he was bound by a strict code of ethics. His failure to report the suspicious financial activity of his now-wife was a major professional violation. I drafted another anonymous complaint, this time to the Financial Regulatory Authority that had previously disciplined him. I laid out the facts. His wife, with no discernible legitimate income source, had received hundreds of thousands of dollars in untaxed, undocumented funds, which were then used for personal enrichment. I suggested that a man with his history of poor judgment should not be in a position of public trust, managing the finances of others. The final piece of the wrecking ball was the most public. I knew a journalist, a woman named Sarah, who had written a series of articles exposing financial corruption in the city's real estate scene. I had worked with her once, providing some background analysis for one of her stories. I contacted her, telling her I had a tip on a major story about a prominent developer. We met in a quiet coffee shop. I laid out a sanitized version of the story, protecting my own identity for the time being, but giving her the core facts. A developer on the verge of collapse, a string of unpaid contractors, a lavish wedding funded by fraudulent means, and a family conspiracy. I gave her the names of the unpaid contractors, including George, knowing they would be more than willing to speak to the press. Sarah's eyes lit up. It was exactly the kind of story she loved. "This is big," she said, her pen flying across her notepad. "If even half of this is true, this guy is finished." "It's all true," I assured her, "and I have the documents to prove it." I had assembled my weapons: a legal shark, a series of regulatory investigations, and a hungry journalist. The pieces were all in place, the dominoes lined up. My father, in his arrogance, believed he was untouchable. My sister believed her online persona was her reality. They had no idea that a storm was gathering, a storm I had engineered with the same meticulous precision I used to balance a ledger. The day before we were set to file the lawsuit and the story was scheduled to go to print, I did one last thing. I drove to my parents' house. I didn't go in. I just parked across the street and looked at the big, imposing structure that was supposed to represent family, security, and love. For me, it now represented a tomb, a place where my trust and my dreams had gone to die. There was no sadness, no lingering sense of loss. There was only a cold, quiet resolve. They had made their choice. They had chosen a party over a person, an image over integrity. They had chosen to sacrifice their daughter on the altar of their own greed. Now they would have to pay the price. The wrecking ball was assembled, and it was about to swing. The day the wrecking ball swung was a Tuesday. It was a day that started like any other for my family, but would end with their world in ashes. The plan was coordinated with the precision of a military operation. At 9:00 a.m., Ms. Reed filed the lawsuit. A process server, a large, no-nonsense man, was dispatched to my father's office at Martin Properties. At the same time, another server was sent to the home Isabel and Ben now shared. They were being served not just with a lawsuit from me, but with the reality of their actions. At 9:30 a.m., Sarah's article dropped. It was the front-page feature on the city's largest online news portal. The headline was explosive. Real estate mogul Martin Properties accused of fraud leaves trail of ruined businesses in wake of lavish family wedding. The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It detailed my father's history of unpaid debts, featuring damning quotes from George and other contractors. It painted a vivid picture of their financial struggles, juxtaposed with photos from Isabel's social media of the ridiculously expensive wedding. Sarah even managed to get a quote from a financial expert who speculated that the company was likely insolvent and operating fraudulently. While my name was kept out of it, the narrative was clear. The family's opulent lifestyle was funded by deceit. By 10:00 a.m., the story was spreading like wildfire. It was being shared across social media, commented on by hundreds of people. The court of public opinion was in session, and the verdict was swift and brutal. I could only imagine the scene at my father's office. The arrival of the process server, the dawning horror as he read the lawsuit, the frantic calls from his business partners and creditors as the news article began to circulate. His carefully constructed facade of success, the very thing he had sacrificed my future to maintain, was being publicly dismantled in real time. For Isabel, the fallout was even more personal. Her influencer world, a fragile ecosystem built on authenticity and audience trust, imploded. The comments section on her wedding photos turned from a sea of fawning congratulations to a torrent of outrage. People called her a fraud, a thief, a spoiled brat who partied while her father ruined people's lives. Her brand partners, terrified of the negative association, began to pull out. By noon, she had lost 3 major sponsorships. Her carefully crafted image was being torn to shreds by the very audience she had cultivated. Meanwhile, the regulatory bodies I had contacted were making their moves. Investigators from the contractor board arrived unannounced at my father's office, demanding to see his financial records. The Financial Regulatory Authority sent a formal letter to Ben's employer, notifying them that he was under investigation for serious ethical violations. His career as a trusted financial advisor was effectively over. The phone calls started in the early afternoon. The first was from my mother. I had unblocked her number that morning, anticipating this moment. She was hysterical. "Jean, what have you done?" she shrieked into the phone. "The news, everyone is calling your father, you've ruined us." "I haven't done anything," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "I simply presented the facts. You and Dad are the ones who ruined yourselves." "How could you be so cruel, to your own family?" she sobbed. "You should have thought of that when you were spending my life savings on champagne and flowers," I said, and then I hung up. The next call was from my father. His voice was not the booming, confident tone I was used to. It was a low, dangerous snarl. "You will regret this," he hissed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I think I do," I said calmly. "You're a bankrupt fraud who is about to be investigated by multiple state agencies. Your business is finished. Your reputation is gone. Your credit is ruined. What are you going to do, Dad? Take out another fake loan?" He was silent for a moment, stunned by my audacity. Then he let out a string of curses and threats before I hung up on him, too. The final call was the one I was waiting for. It came from Ms. Reed. "They're panicking," she said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "Their lawyer just called me. He says your father is willing to make this right." "Define make this right," I said. "He's offering to pay you back the principal amount, in installments over the next 5 years, if you drop the lawsuit and issue a public retraction." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Absolutely not. The time for quiet deals is over. This is not a negotiation. It is a collections process." I instructed Ms. Reed to relay my terms. I didn't want a payment plan. I wanted a lump sum. I wanted the full amount, plus interest, plus damages, plus all of my legal fees. I knew he didn't have the cash. Which led to my real demand. He was to sign over the deed to the family home, his last major, unleveraged asset to me. The house itself was worth more than what he had stolen. It would be my compensation. His lawyer called back within the hour. The answer was a definitive no. The house was his pride and joy, the symbol of everything he had built. He would rather go to court. "Fine," I told Ms. Reed. "Let him. But make sure his lawyer understands that when we go to court, I will be subpoenaing my sister's and my mother's financial records. I will put them on the stand, and I will ask them, under oath, where they thought the money for their lavish lifestyle was coming from. We'll see how the family sticks together when faced with perjury charges." That was the final blow. An hour later, his lawyer called back. My father had agreed to my terms. He would sign over the house. I had won. It wasn't a joyous victory. It was a grim, hollow one. I had exposed my family, ruined their lives, and taken their home, but it was a necessary victory. It was the final invoice for a debt that was never just about money. It was about respect, trust, and the painful price of betrayal. The laughter had stopped. The party was over. All that was left was to sort through the wreckage. A month later, I stood in the living room of my childhood home. It was no longer my parents' home. It was mine. The closing had been a quiet, tense affair. My father had signed the papers with a trembling hand, his face a mask of barely contained rage. He hadn't looked at me once. My mother had just wept silently. As per the agreement, they had been given 30 days to vacate the premises. The house was empty now, stripped of all the furniture, the photos, the personal touches that had made it a home. All that remained were the echoes of a life that was now over. The faint outlines on the walls where pictures used to hang were like ghosts, reminders of a family that had been a lie. The fallout from my actions had been catastrophic for them, just as I had intended. My father's company, Martin Properties, had officially filed for bankruptcy. The investigations by the state boards had uncovered years of fraudulent practices, and he was now facing potential criminal charges. His name, once respected in the city's business circles, was now synonymous with disgrace. Isabel's influencer career was completely destroyed. Her online presence was a wasteland of angry comments and accusations. She and Ben had been forced to sell their new home to cover their mounting legal bills. Ben had been fired from his job, his license as a financial advisor suspended indefinitely. They had gone from the city's golden couple to social pariahs in the span of a few weeks. According to a mutual acquaintance, they had moved into a small rental apartment in a less fashionable part of town, their fairy tale life reduced to a cautionary tale. My mother was living with a sister in a neighboring state. She had tried to call me a few more times, leaving tearful, rambling voicemails that swung between begging for my forgiveness and blaming me for tearing the family apart. I never listened to them in full. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened. I had my justice. I had my money back and then some in the form of the house. I had my revenge. But as I stood in the silent, empty house, I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. I felt a profound, aching emptiness. I had won the war, but the battlefield was my own life, and the casualties were the people who, for all their flaws, were still my family. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. I saw the spot where we used to put the Christmas tree. I saw the doorway with the pencil marks tracking my and Isabel's height as we grew up. These memories were now tainted, part of a story that had ended in betrayal and ruin. I had no intention of living in the house. It held too many ghosts, too many painful memories. My plan was to sell it, take the proceeds, and finally start my firm. That dream, the one they had tried to steal from me, was now within my grasp. It was a future I had earned, twice over. A few days later, as I was meeting with a real estate agent at the house, a car pulled up to the curb. It was Isabel. I hadn't seen her since the wedding. She looked diminished. The vibrant, confident glow she always had was gone, replaced by a weary pallor. She was no longer wearing designer clothes, just simple jeans and a t-shirt. She got out of the car and walked up the driveway, stopping a few feet away from me. "I just wanted to see it one last time," she said, her voice quiet, stripped of its usual bravado. I just nodded, unsure of what to say. "He's a monster, you know," she said, looking at the house. "Dad, I always knew he was ruthless, but I didn't know it was your money, not all of it. I thought he was just being a father." "He was," I said, my voice flat. "He was being the father he always was. He just finally sent you the bill." She winced, then looked at me, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of resentment and something that looked like reluctant respect. "You really did it," she whispered. "You burned it all to the ground." "I just held up a mirror," I replied. "You all were the ones who set the fire." We stood in silence for another moment. The chasm between us, once a simple matter of different personalities, was now a vast, unbridgeable canyon of betrayal and consequence. I'm sorry, Jean, she finally said, the words sounding foreign and clumsy on her tongue. It wasn't a full-throated apology, not the kind that heals wounds, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement, an admission. I gave her a small, tight nod. Goodbye, Isabelle. She turned and walked back to her car, not looking back. I watched her drive away until she was out of sight. Selling the house was the final act of severing my past. The day the sale closed, I transferred the money to a new business account. The next morning, I signed the lease on a small, bright office space in a building downtown. The sign on the door would read, Jean and Associates, Forensic Accounting. My life was quieter now, smaller. The gaping hole where my family used to be was a constant presence. But for the first time, my life was entirely my own. My future was not tied to anyone else's promises or lies. It was built on a foundation of my own making, one that was solid, secure, and true. The numbers, finally, were all in balance.